Herbert Simon and others in the public administration field have these theories of organization which talk about how decisions are made and implemented. It is important to realize that in the public sector, most of the decision making takes place in the political process. Makes an important point here, pointing out that information and values blend to form decisions. It is important to realize that all decision making in the public sector is subject to multiple compromises at multiple levels. The point in this slide is in the third bullet. All truth is a matter of interpretation. You might entertain yourself by looking up the same event and comparing Fox News with Al Jazeera, CNN, Financial Times, New York Times, and Singapore Straits Times coverage and portrayal and emphasis of the particular issue involved. Discusses the mass public versus attentive publics. However, the attentive publics, those groups, sometimes called special interests, that have a particular interest in the topic are the key players. Compromises surrounding their specific needs arise throughout the process. Legislation is the result of compromise in both houses of Congress or both houses of your legislature, and then yet more compromises with the governor or president, in addition to compromises with the interest groups as they're known. With the rational approach is that efficiency is not the highest value in government. Equity is much more important in government decision making. This is why, for instance, it costs the same amount to send a letter across the street or across the nation. With respect to market-like forces, the issue always arises, what are the incentives? You may view the incentives on an individual or group in a certain way, but it is their perception of the incentives that is dispositive. Too much to say about this slide. I think that in practice, certainly in my experience, the bargaining approach is certainly the most common. In my experience, participation is more of a theoretical construct than an actual reality. The difficulty with processing inputs and outputs is the perception of the recipients may differ from those of the providers. Further complicating the matter is the broad spectrum of providers is actually the taxpayers rather than, say, a congressional committee of jurisdiction or the people receiving the benefit. Therefore, maximizing output, minimizing inputs, and those kinds of things are all problematic in terms of how they're determined. In over 40 years of public service and academic study of the public service, I have never seen a fully rational approach employed. If you review the psychological literature and its intersection with economics, you will find that most of the recent literature talks about emotional decision making that is then rationally justified. Satisficing has become part of the public administration literature. It is probably satisfactory in some scenarios. However, it is overwhelmed by political considerations in the general case. Choice has become very popular and is a rationale for outsourcing. I think it is inescapably true that public officials, i.e., civil servants, are self-interested. If they were not, public service unionization would not be so common, nor would the constant demands for increased pay and benefits be evident. However, turning things over to the private sector and, quote, running government like a business, unquote, does not work. The reason is simple. In the government environment, people expect their rights to be respected. This is one of the major challenges in privatization. It shows up very, very vividly in prison privatization because you still must take consideration for the rights of the prisoners. But it is evident in all forms of privatization. Besides, the running government like a business idea is bankrupt on its face. Let me just pose a rhetorical question. When you call 911, do you expect to be asked for your MasterCard number? I must disagree with our author when he says that the naive belief that government bureaucrats are driven to maximize their own utility. I believe that that is the case, and that to assume otherwise is to assume some different kind of human being than the one we commonly meet is engaged in the public service. Public choice does not avoid the what government should do question to the extent that our author implies, in my opinion. Within the concept of market forces, there is the concept of demand, and those services that are in demand or are demanded are the ones that would be provided. Bargaining approach is much more comprehensive than is implied in public administration theory, in my opinion. You can see the evidence of the bargaining approach and its pervasive nature in the tax code. Even if all you file is a 1040 form, you notice all of the special interest provisions that you don't qualify for as you skip lines on the 1040 form. All of those represent specific provisions put into the tax code to attract political support and to get the bills passed. With respect to excuse me for the break. With respect to incrementalism, the idea of limiting alternatives is not really the major point, in my opinion. Incrementalism is really the addition of small items over time that builds the budget and the department as you move forward. And often this is the case with so-called pilot programs. Pilot program generates a constituency, the constituency makes more demands, the demands are met by incrementally adding to the budget or expanding the program. Sometimes this is known as mission creep. For instance, Social Security began as a supplement to retirement plans and now takes in disability and widows and orphans and other things for which it was never originally intended. These things were all added incrementally over time. Point in this slide or in this section is the question about bargaining out differences. In my experience, and I believe in yours, more often they're all just included and all benefits are spread around to a wider and wider audience in order to gain sufficient votes for passage. This is true in every political situation of which I'm aware, from the 5-member utility board that I served on early in my career through the multi-nation OECD experience that I had shortly before leaving the federal service. Participation as an approach, in my experience, has really been a question of convincing the populace of pre-made decisions rather than anything else. For instance, I was involved in the governor's conversation with Oregon during the Barbara Roberts administration. It quickly became clear to me that the only purpose was to implement a sales tax. The public was consulted, but essentially it was an attempt to persuade them to vote for a sales tax, which failed, and Oregon still does not have a sales tax. It also wrecked Ms. Roberts' entire administration. With respect to what is called the NIMBY phenomenon, the idea that citizens have control over these things is very, very selective in its application. The question really revolves around who has political power. You are unlikely to see a homeless shelter in an upscale suburb. While a participative approach as a theory has some value, it is difficult to actually confer power on the citizens because our representative Republican form of government prohibits it. I think the limits to the approaches is fairly comprehensive. The difficulties revolve around the knowledge needed to actually make a decision and all of the political compromises necessary to get a decision adopted by the appropriate legislative authorities. It is important to note that the author does mention bureaucratic pathologies. Limiting information, delaying information, etc. is a very common bureaucratic tactic. Finally, I think it's very important to understand the uncertainty around all issues in the public sector. We don't know what the outcomes will be of given initiatives. However, every initiative will have or generate a constituency that supports its continuation and expansion. Second, many issues require very long time frames, which is inconsistent with the career paths and election cycles. For instance, if you were to implement an educational change, you would have to wait 12 years to see if it actually came into fruition, and somehow you would have to take into account all of the changes in the society that occurred during those 12 years. This is assuming you could determine the outcome or gain some unanimity on the outcome desirable. At the completion of high school, should a person be able to speak a foreign language, do calculus, play football, play a violin, appreciate fine music? What should they be able to do is a question that can never be resolved fully because the definitions of a good education are different for almost every individual. Management is probably the least understood and most difficult process to understand and take in hand. The primary reason, in my view, is that it is all probabilistic, meaning it is subject to statistical variation. If you forecast what is going to happen, the outcome of a specific program, etc., you are talking about something that's going to happen in the future. The further into the future you forecast, the more likely it is that you're wrong. You can be wrong for many reasons. Perhaps conditions have changed. More likely, the situation was not fully analyzed in the first place. The example of Hurricane Katrina's devastation of New Orleans is a very good example. The storm surge of Katrina came up a canal that was dredged straight through the Delta in order to maintain New Orleans' competitive situation with respect to other ports in the area as a deep water port. Therefore, the storm surge had a direct channel right to the center of New Orleans. This channel was dredged and maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers at the instigation of the congressional delegation from Louisiana. At the time, at least from the records that are available to me, no one considered the storm surge issue because the maintenance of economic conditions with respect to New Orleans being a deep water port competitive with Galveston and Houston and others was the only matter really under consideration. Barriers to risk are primarily involve guilt and other time constraints. No one wants to be responsible. That's why you hear the term the nameless, faceless bureaucrat. It's also why I think in the language we hear we, as opposed to I made such and such a decision or did such and such a thing. This diffuse irresponsibility is directly responsible for the recent Flint, Michigan lead poisoning in the water problem. It is true that all these approaches are expressions of theories. What is not clear from our text is that these theories are largely propounded by people with no practical experience. If you take the average PhD in the public administration field, my peers, you will find that almost all of them, without exception, have absolutely no experience outside of the school environment. This produces what is sometimes called the theory-practice gap.